Hi everyone, hopefully you can hear me and see me. Today we're going to be talking all about REST APIs and how to connect with them without any code. All three of us on the call right now are very experienced with REST APIs, so we have a lot of information to share with you. Trying to change the slide. It's always a struggle first thing in the morning. So these are your presenters today. There's me, Sienna. There's also Sinai. Say hi, Sinai.
Hi, everyone.
And Laura as well. How
Good
are you guys
morning.
feeling this morning?
Good.
Yeah. Pretty excited here. Yeah, this is Sinai's first webinar, so it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm excited for it.
Yeah, it's going to be very exciting. And she's done a lot of work with REST APIs, particularly with our CityWorks application integration stuff. So she's super knowledgeable and she's a great presenter too. So it's really just a treat to see her first webinar this morning.
Yay.
Yay. All right. So I'm going to kill all of our cameras right now, and then we'll dive right into it. Like I said, we have lots of information to share with you.
Well, one quick introduction before we head on. We've got a few people doing Q&A behind the scenes here today as well. So we have Stephanie, who's usually helping us with all of our webinars, so she'll be making sure things are running smoothly today. We've also got Mark and Dave, who will also be here to help answer any questions that you have as we go through all our content for today.
All right, so this is what we're going to be covering today. So first, what is a REST API? So this webinar was really in mind of people who've never used REST APIs before. So we're going to be going over the very basics of how to use a REST API. Next, we're going to be talking about FME. So if you don't know, this is a webinar by Safe Software. So we'll be talking about our product FME and how to use APIs within FME as well. Next, we'll be talking about authentication in APIs. So this is super important, and one of the trickiest parts about using APIs is understanding the different types of authentication and exactly what you need to do to be able to authenticate your calls. After that, we'll be talking about automating your API workflows. So using FME, you can build no-code applications. So you can pull resources directly from your web services and be able to host them online in a no-code application. So Laura will be showing that off, as well as just scheduling API workflows. A lot of times people who want to work with APIs want to schedule these workflows so they don't have to manually run these jobs themselves. So Laura will be chatting about that. Finally, we'll have a live Q&A and wrap up. So any questions you have throughout this presentation, if we think they're really valuable to share with everyone, we will do that in like a live Q&A. So we'll hop on the webcams again and we'll just talk through any questions you might have. So why are people interested in using APIs? And I think a really good example is, let's say you have to do something like a manual task every day, where you have to go online to a web service. You have to log in, you have to click a bunch of buttons, maybe navigate to the right tab and download a report. And if you're doing this every single day over and over again, those clicks start to add up and it starts to be a lot of time. So you might want to use an API to get around this. APIs allow you to access web services without going through the normal UI to get to them. So APIs can automate your manual processes. They also allow you to fetch the most up-to-date data. So let's say you need data. An example I'll be using in this presentation is traffic data. That's data that you don't really want, that's out of date, because that could give you some very misleading information. So APIs can be used to fetch the most up-to-date data so that you're always using the correct information. After that, you can also send data directly to the web, so you can post to web services as well. And then you can integrate your application. So let's say there's a lot of web services you want to connect to, and maybe you want to have them all talk together. So you can integrate your applications using APIs as well. So let's talk about application programming interfaces, and that's what APIs stand for. So APIs can be used to request specific data, you can update records or delete records programmatically. So this is all, sorry, this is all without going through the UI. So I did this little diagram here, and first we have a client, we have the API, and then we have the server. So the client in our case will typically be Fme. And the server is the application you're trying to connect to. So Fme or your client will send information via the API. The server then receives this information and it's able to translate it. Once the server translates it, it will send it back to the API, which is then received by the client. So the API kind of sits between your client and your server. I've heard it be referred to as like a waiter. It's a person that takes the order and fulfills the order after it's been completed by your chef. So it sits in the middle and it can communicate between these two options. So there is some important API terminology. And don't worry, you don't have to memorize this. As you get used to working with APIs, it all kind of comes naturally to you. Also, if you're working with an API, you're going to be nose deep in the documentation for that API. So everything you need to know should be within that API documentation. And then it's really just filling out these different labels in this different section. So it's not going to be very complicated once you get started with APIs. So today we're talking about REST APIs. So REST APIs are really great because they are pretty easy to use. They all have a uniform structure. So that means all REST APIs should follow a similar kind of format to them. They should all have these components to them, which makes it very easy to use if you're using different REST API sources. They also use a URL to call the resource, and we'll be seeing that a little later on in the demo. So next we have the HTTP method. The HTTP method is also called the HTTP verb. And it's called a verb because it's like the action you're doing. So a typical one will be a get. You're getting data from somewhere. You can also post data or delete data. And these are all different HTTP methods you could use. Next, you have your request headers. So they give some context to the call that you're using. Oftentimes you'll be setting, hey, I'm sending JSON to this web service, and that is set in the request header. Or you'll say, hey, I want to receive a JSON back. Again, that's set in the request header. And your documentation will be able to tell you what request headers you need to use to send this call properly. Finally, we have the HTTP body. So the HTTP body specifies the information that needs to be modified, created, or deleted. Oftentimes in GET calls, when you're getting information from a web service, you won't need to specify the request body because you'll be getting specific information. However, if you're posting information, you'll often need a request body because the information you're posting might be contained in that request body if it's not contained in a file. So I know that's a lot of terminology, and honestly, it does get pretty intimidating when you just look at something like this. But once you start working with it, you'll realize, oh, it's pretty easy to use because all I have to do is copy and paste information from one place to another. And as long as I do that properly, these calls should work. So throughout our demos today, we'll be showing you the documentation and then how to map these two together. So don't worry if you don't understand all of these terminology right away. We can work on it and you'll see like, oh, it's actually quite easy to use once you start to get going. So this is example API documentation. This is from the Fme server REST API. And in our API, you can actually try out calls right in the interface. So there's this little try it out button down at the bottom, so you can try this out yourself. So you just log in, you'll request a token, and then you can modify these parameters and see how it changes something like the request URL or the request header or the request body. So it's quite interesting to use, and it's quite an easy way to get started with REST APIs. So in our documentation, you'll notice that things are highlighted. But the first one is kind of hidden. So the HTTP method is contained up here. And in this case, this is a post. So it's in the top left of the screen, right by security and accounts. So it is a post, so you're posting information to the web service. The rest of them should be pretty easy to find. Down below response codes, we have our request URL, we have our request headers, and our request body as well. So everything you need to know should be contained in the documentation. If it's not contained in the documentation, probably talk to the service about why it's not contained in the documentation. So again, just some benefits of REST APIs. So you can automatically send data to a web service. You can create reports with the most up-to-date data possible. And you can also integrate multiple data sets together from multiple services. And you can do this at a transactional level if you're using a REST API. So it works out really well if you're trying to achieve application integration. So I've been talking about how to use an application programming interface, but without talking about how you can get around any programming. Well, you can do this using third-party tools. So third-party tools allow users to access the APIs without writing any code themselves. So today we'll be discussing Fme because that's the product we use. However, there are other products you can use for this, like if you want to just practice making quick calls, but you don't want to do like the automation that we'll be talking about today, you can use something like Postman as well, which is a free tool. So let's talk about what Fme Desktop is. So Fme Desktop is a tool you can use to connect lots of different data together. You can read in data from over 450 systems, and then you can transform that data using transformers. You can run these workflows locally, or you can publish them up to Fme server to run them on something like a schedule or in response to another event. So Fme Desktop is what we'll be showing off today, is how we build these workflows. Typically, why people use Fme Desktop is because of its unrivaled data support. So we can support lots of different formats. We started in the GIS world, so we're particularly skilled at supporting spatial data. But since then, we've really come a long way and we can support lots of different formats together. So pretty much anything you're using, you can read in data from these different platforms. You can see around 2010 here is when we first started using web services, and our support of web services has really just expanded since then. So you may not even need to do any of this work using the REST API or reading the documentation if you are using something that we already support. So we have lots of connectors that automatically read from APIs, such as the ArcGIS Online connector. You can manage files in ArcGIS Online using that connector, and that all uses the REST API. So all you have to do is fill out the parameters that you want to set, and then you're good to go there. You don't necessarily need to use a REST API to be able to connect to it. We also use the Google Sheets REST API, or if you have a link to a file, like let's say you just have a CSV and you have the link to the file, it's stored somewhere online, you can actually put that right in a reader. So a reader is what we call something that inputs data. So it'll give you a little option for the file path. And instead of writing your file path to something that's, say, on your desktop, all you have to do is copy and paste that link into the CSV reader, and it'll read in that CSV directly from a web source. So let's talk about powerful API transformers. So if you're using APIs, these are the tools you will most likely be using. So transformers are what we have in our workspace, and they help us transform our data. So at first, we have a creator. So typically, a workflow would consist of a reader, and that would initiate your workflow. However, with REST APIs, if you're only using a REST API, you're not going to have a traditional reader because your HTTP caller will act as your reader. So you can use a creator to kick off your workflow. After that, we have an HTTP caller. So this is what reaches out to the web service. And we'll be looking at the HTTP caller and its settings in my demo. After that, we have the JSON fragmenter. So the JSON fragmenter can parse the JSON that's received from the REST API. So most REST APIs will give us back some JSON to work with. This JSON comes all in one clump, and so we need to parse it. We need to break it down to get the usable attributes from it. I'll be showing that in a demo in one moment. So let's take a look at the demo that I have today. So this is with traffic data. So this kind of came from a real life experience for me. When we were going into the office, when we weren't working from home, I lived pretty close to safe, about 15 minutes away. However, I did live across a bridge. So if there's an accident on the bridge, I'd be stuck in traffic forever just trying to get home. So sometimes my 15-minute drive would turn into 50 just because we needed to clear the traffic on the bridge and be able to get the traffic flowing again. So I decided, okay, I did it once. I'm never going to do that again. I'm always going to check the traffic before I leave to make sure there's not an accident on the bridge. And if there is, I'll just stay at work and work a little longer because I'd much rather be at work than waiting in traffic. So, you know, you get kind of tired of doing that. Like I didn't always want to go into Google Maps and always look up, okay, how's the traffic today? So I decided it might be a little easier if I just use an API instead. So the goal of this demo is to get the most up-to-date traffic information, but I want this to be tailored to my commute. I'm not driving all over Vancouver. I don't need everything in Vancouver. I just need the information for my commute. So I can look this up online, but I might get a lot of unnecessary information I don't need. So the solution is to use Fme. So I could use Fme to get data directly from the Drive BC API. And my result is I can create a custom HTML page with my commute information. So I'll show this off in a demo. So before starting any REST API workflow, always check the REST API documentation. And that will give you information you need to be able to do this kind of workflow. So if I go back, this is the REST API documentation for the Drive BC API. You'll notice that it is pretty sparse compared to the Fme server REST API, but that's for good reason. These calls are very simple to make, and there's not a lot of information you need to know to be able to make these calls. Also, it's all open data, so you can get to these requests without any authentication. So all I really have to do is copy this URL and paste it. It doesn't specify what HTTP method I need to use. However, I know it's a GET request because I'm not posting my traffic data. I'm not deleting traffic data. So it must be a GET request that I'll use. So I'll show you how this looks like when creating a workflow in Fme. So I open this up, and this is Fme Workbench. The first thing I need to do is click on my canvas and then add a transformer. I want to kick off my workflow, so I'll use a creator transformer. After my creator, I'll need an HTTP caller. And all I have to do is connect these two together. I can open up my HTTP caller and copy and paste my URL in here. And again, use the get method. In our later examples, you'll be shown how to use these other things in here. But for now, I have no headers, I have no body for this. So I'm just trying to get some information. And now I can run this. So once I run it, I can see I get this response body. So this is a lot of information, and this is all kind of clumped together. You might be familiar with pretty prints in JSON. So using the JSON formatter, you can pretty this up a little bit to really be able to understand the data that you're seeing. So all this is going to do, it's not going to change the data itself, it's just going to change how it's printed. It might be a little hard to see, but there's a formatted column here that I'm opening up where I can see the data that I have. So it's important to understand the structure of your JSON when you're working with it, because we will need to know this to be able to modify it later. So what I'm really looking for here is just this events tab. I want to make sure I can get all of this information that's sitting inside events. By scrolling through this JSON, I can see that events is an array, and then all these features are sitting inside events, and they always start with this jurisdiction URL. So next I can add my JSON fragmenter. And I can even delete this JSON formatter because I don't really need it anymore. So with the JSON fragmenter, I'm going to get the response body that was returned from the API. I could leave it like this just to see what I get. And what this is going to do is it's going to break up the JSON. So I can see here my JSON index. Sorry if that's a little hard to see, but under JSON index, I see events. And this contains everything I need to know. So to be able to get to that, I need to go into my JSON fragmenter again and parse that out. So what I'm going to do is just write events in here and then keep that wildcard character in there because I want to get everything that's inside it. Should be able to open up my text editor to make that a little bit more visible. So I'm looking for everything inside events is what this query is saying. Next, I can choose to flatten this out. So by flattening it, you are exposing those attributes. And then I can hit run again. So this is going to take it and it's going to return 50 attributes. However, you'll see here that I don't have something like my jurisdiction URL or my headline available for me to use right now. If I click on it, I can see that this information is stored in here, but it's just not visible for me to use. So for me to use it, I have to expose it. And that's where this attributes to expose comes in. If I had an example of this JSON, I can import attributes to expose here. So I don't need to manually type it out if I don't want to. However, for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll just type out a few values here. So these are values I'm getting directly from here. So I want the headline, I want to know what it is, I want the geography, and I want the description as well. And now I can click run. The next thing I want to do is I want to get that geography and be able to use it. This geography is stored in GeoJSON, so I can use the geometry replacer. And I'm going to get the geography. to write this out, run it again. So this will take my data and I'll turn it into geometry that I can use. As you can see here, it's not lining up correctly on my background map, and that's because I don't have a coordinate system set. Typically, if you're using Fme, most formats will tell us what coordinate system to use, but something like GeoJson won't. So all I have to do is set my coordinate system, press OK, and I should be able to see this correctly on my map. And there it is. There's 50 points throughout BC, I should say points and lines, with some traffic data attached. So I decided to add something to this as well. I wanted to use an HTML report generator. So up to here, it's the same as what I just showed you. However, I used a slightly different call. This is another one of the examples from the Drive BC API, but they had one with a bounding box around Vancouver. I thought that'd be useful because that's where I live. That's where I want to know the traffic data. So I could write out an HTML report with no code as well. All I have to do is fill in some information here, like my map and my table, and then I can write out this HTML report. So I can have something like this be emailed to me every day with my traffic data. But I wanted to go a step further. I wanted to know specifically what my commute looks like. I don't drive around Vancouver every day. Thankfully, that would be awful. So I just want to know what's the information for my commute. So to do this, I wanted to get some GeoJson just with my commute. To do this, I used another web service. So this one is geojson.io. And you can see I very, very poorly digitized this here. I digitized what would be an awful commute that you could have a much shorter way if you just went directly. But I just wanted to make sure I covered both bridges because I know those are often where you have accidents that really ruin your commute for you. All I did was click share, or sorry, not share, save as GeoJson, which downloaded it to my desktop. And using the GeoJson reader, I read this in. So as you can see here, I do have my GeoJson present in my background map. It's right here. I wanted to add a buffer around it, and that's because I digitized it very poorly, so I wanted to make sure that my roads were actually covered. And then I used a transformer called a clipper. So what the clipper does, it will clip your data. So I only want the points that will connect with these lines. So I can see I have two potential instances that I could run into on my commute. And again, you could create a, well, it looks like they're just construction. But if you wanted, you could create an HTML report with just these instances as well. So that's everything I had to share. I'm going to pass this off to Sinai, who will be talking about authentication in REST APIs.
Okay, thanks, Sienna. Now that we know what an API is and how it can help us do lots of interesting things on the web, let's talk about security. Some of us at some point have clicked on a link only to be presented with an access denied page. You've basically met the API's security guard and he's telling you, please identify yourself so I can tell you whether you're allowed to be here or not. Luckily, Fme has the tools to connect and authenticate yourself from within your workspaces, so you'll never have to worry about gaining access to your API of choice. You might be wondering why APIs have security anyways. Security allows the API to control who and what is accessing the resources and functionality by authenticating you and then authorizing you. So after you've shown your valid ID to the API's security guard, the API knows that you're allowed to be there. That's authentication. Once you're authenticated, the API can now decide what you can and cannot see. That's authorization. So as another example, you might be a customer at a bank and you're able to successfully authenticate with your bank's API. However, just because the bank knows who you are, that doesn't mean that they're going to let you see just anyone's account balance or start making transfers from accounts that aren't yours. This is why APIs and web services have a layer of security that limits access to their content and functionality called authentication. It helps them filter requests that are coming from potentially unknown people, bots, or even malicious programs. And in most cases, you'll need to authenticate yourself with an API to start making your requests. So FME supports many types of authentication. There's 3 types of HTTP authentication where you directly provide your username and password for an account you have with that website or service. Basic authentication sends those credentials over a network in plain text. It's the most common and supported by many, many APIs. Digest authentication works mostly the same way, but it's made more secure by adding a layer of encryption to those credentials. Lastly, NTLM protocol is similar to Digest, but you're providing your Windows login information. So you'll commonly see this between Microsoft products. Beyond HTTP protocols, FME supports other types of authentication too. So sometimes you might have to send an API key or web token with your calls. In both cases, those are a unique string to identify yourself or the app making the request. Lastly, many APIs and web services these days are protected by OAuth 2. This is a secure method for an app to obtain and identify itself with the token. We're going to get more to this in a minute, but first, managing all of these usernames, passwords, different APIs, different authentication types could potentially be overwhelming. Luckily, with FME Web Connections, you can both connect and manage everything from directly inside the platform. So FME Web Connections provide a convenient and secure way to store, share, and reuse connection parameters throughout your workflows on both FME Workbench and Server. They save your credentials as a secure named container that you can use in your workspace whenever you need it. So if you want to read or write data from the web, make multiple calls to the same service, or maybe you'd like an automation or self-serve workspace to connect to a web service on FME Server. Whatever your needs, Web Connections can make it easy to authenticate your API calls without too much effort. So you can store any of the supported authentication methods in a web connection, but they're especially useful for OAuth 2. FME is shipped with templates that connect to many web services that use OAuth. Many of them you would have heard of, most likely. So Google Suite, Microsoft products, Autodesk, Dropbox, and Slack are among them. And if it's not included, we supply some tools to help you create those custom connections. So if you've ever skipped the step of creating a new website account by using your Google account to log into a website, you've used OAuth 2. OAuth basically lets you give permission to an app to access a web service without having to directly hand over your credentials. Another example of OAuth you might be familiar with is two-factor authentication. FME has a lot of web services already registered. You just have to log in using that app interface. If you have a web service in mind that uses OAuth but isn't registered yet, it's simple to set up. You'll register FME as an app with that service, obtain some information about your account, and then input that information into a Workbench template. We don't have time to get into the detail right now, but if you're interested, please click on this tutorial link to see an example of setting up a custom OAuth connection in FME with the Google API. So, as I mentioned, you can choose from a variety of registered web services to connect to from inside Workbench. They're already set up, you just have to log in. And on our community platform, FME Hub, you will also be able to find and download from an ever-growing selection of custom web connection templates that our team or user community have uploaded. You might be wondering what it actually looks like to use authentication in a workspace. So some of these settings can be found inside the HTTP call transformer. Most of the time, you'll just select the Use Authentication option and choose your preferred method. Connecting to most types is just as easy as entering your username and password, and Fme will handle the rest. If you're not sure which authentication method to use, always check your API's documentation. This is the documentation page for accessing Google's API. In this case, you can see that it's OAuth 2. So with this in mind, you'll know that you'll have to use a web connection in your workspace. This is the documentation for Fme Servers API. And to authenticate with this API, you'll need to include an authorization token in your calls headers. So now for my demo, I'm going to showcase a workflow that pulls data from an API about bald eagle migratory patterns. Using Fme, I'm going to take that data from the web, transform it, and stream it back to a web map. To do this, we're going to need to use a couple different authentication types to use a couple different web services. We're going to connect to the Workbench API with basic authentication, and then we'll connect to ArcGIS Online with a stored OAuth web connection. Okay. So Workbench is a free online platform maintained by researchers to catalog and share animal movement data. Using their website, I can look at a bald eagle study that we're interested in right here in British Columbia. So if I select the study, I can open it up to see more information about it. This page gives us a summary of information about the study, its metadata, such as a Workbench ID. I suspect we're going to need this unique identifier to make an API request later. But for now, we need to know how to make calls to this API so we can pull the bald eagle data into our workflow. I can view the Workbench API's documentation by going to Tools, API. Here I can use their resources to find out what kind of requests I can make and how to make them. So we want to request a CSV for our data. So I can select accessing the database using HTTP and CSV requests. The first thing I notice is that it says I have to provide valid credentials in order to obtain a CSV file. So let's keep that in mind when we're authenticating our calls. But it looks like there's quite a few different kinds of CSVs to request, so we can narrow it down by going back to the menu options again. We want to request a single bald eagle's migratory pattern, so I believe that'll be get event data for an individual animal. In this section, it gives me an example request for a call. You can take note of some of the query parameters, such as the entity type, the study ID, which we saw on the study's summary page, and an individual ID. They also show the CSV data that I'll receive back. I can build this call using these parameters in Fme Workbench with the HTTP caller. So let's head over to the workspace. So this is our workspace for connecting to the Workbench API. We're doing a few things here. We're requesting and downloading a CSV from the Workbench API. We're reading that CSV that contains the locations of our bald eagles, and then we're going to format the data for readability and send it to a map. Let's focus on the HTTP caller first. It's set up to make a call for the Workbench API. Now we're just requesting the data, so I've selected a GET request. You'll recognize the format and all of the parameters from the documentation. So here's the URL. And we also have our query parameters set up in a table here. So we have our entity type, our study ID from the study's summary page, and I've made a user parameter for the individual ID because I'd like to be able to look up different birds in the study. Instead of saving the response body to a JSON body or parameter in my workspace, like Sienna did in her demo, this time I'd like to save the response body to a file because I want a CSV. I've set up that file path to a location on my computer. So everything looks good now. I've constructed my request, so we can just try running it. right away, we can see that my request was rejected. If I open up the error, we can see that familiar and dreaded 401 authorization required. This is because we forgot to send our authentication credentials with our call and the API doesn't know who we are. So remember when we looked at the API documentation, it says that we must provide our credentials to request a CSV. So let's try basic authentication. If I open up the HTTP caller again, down at the bottom is the use authentication parameter. When I select the method, I can see a variety of protocols to choose from, but as we said, we're happy with basic for now. We can always try something different. I've created a MoveBank account already, so I'm just going to enter my credentials now. Okay, so now that we've filled out credentials, I'll rerun the call. And we have a successful response. That 200 status code means that our request was received successfully. So the feature reader allows us to read any FME supported file format into our workflow. I would like to enter the file path for our CSV as the data set, and we can pull all of that bald eagle data in our CSV into our workspace. If I read it in, we can see that we have just over 1,000 records, but they're hidden. So I'm going to have to use that attribute exposer to bring them into our workflow. Now we can see we have location coordinates and timestamps for our bird, which is awesome. Using these coordinates, I can use the vertex creator to create point geometry. So you can see that I've entered the location for the latitude and longitude. If I run that, we can see our bald eagle's migratory patterns can now be visualized on a map inside of our workspace. So everything's looking good. Our timestamps are very accurate, which is great, but it might be easier to visualize this data seasonally. So the date time converter can convert timestamps into any format that we choose, including custom ones. So I'm just going to reduce this complicated timestamp into a month and a day. Once we have the month and a day, we can use the attribute range mapper to map these months and days into seasons. So we have winter, spring, summer, and fall. Okay, so now that each record is associated with a season, we want to write out this data to ArcGIS Online. This is another web service that's going to require authentication. So if we were to add an ArcGIS Online writer to our canvas, the parameters ask us to authenticate with a web connection. I can choose one that I've already saved, or I can add a new web connection with OAuth 2. This pop-up login page is exactly what you'd expect from this kind of web service. All you would have to do is log into your ArcGIS Online account and you'd have access to all of your content. But I've already connected and I've selected the feature service that I want to write to, so now we can just finish this workflow. Okay, so while that writes, it'll be done by the time we get to our map. So I can head over to ArcGIS Online and view our results. So these points represent that CSV data that we pulled from MoveBank. We can see the bald eagle's locations as well as the seasons that we formatted in our FME workspace. Anytime that this workflow is run, you'll have the most up-to-date information available as it's pulled from the web service on demand. You can imagine this as a dashboard or notification system that keeps all of your users informed. A great way to do this would be by automating this workflow or making it self-serve with FME Server. And to talk more about how we can do that, I will pass it over to Laura.
Okay, yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of taking these workflows to the next level. So Sienna and Sinai kind of showed the basics of connecting to these APIs, getting the data you need, and sending it to the output format that you'd like, as well as handling the different types of authentication and passing your credentials for your different calls. So once that's done, automating these workflows is often a really good plan. So for example, maybe you'd like to avoid having to manually run these jobs every single time you'd like to update your data. So you can have things like scheduling a job to run frequently. So looking at Sinai's example, where she was pulling information about the locations of bald eagles, perhaps like you're interested in seeing where they're traveling on a day-to-day basis or a weekly basis, but you don't want to have to remember to come in and click run on a workspace and update all your maps. You can use automation to make sure that those maps get updated as frequently as you need instead, without you having to come in and do anything yourself. Another option is the ability to run these jobs in response to events in real time. So maybe you have a workflow that needs to react to certain changes in things from other applications. So you can have these run, if an email comes in, or looking at the bald eagle example, maybe if an eagle, some kind of an alert happens, you'd like to run these and update these maps automatically. So we'll talk through a few different options for doing that. And then finally, the ability to create apps to run these jobs on demand. So kind of thinking back to Sienna's example, where she was showing getting information about her commute first thing in the morning. Maybe she'd like to be able to run this just before she leaves for work in the morning. So we could present an app for her to be able to come in, draw the commute that she's thinking about doing, and then click run and see what the current traffic conditions are whenever she needs to check on that. So we'll talk through some ways of doing this. So for this, I'll be using Fme Server to help me automate these workflows. So for anyone who's not very familiar with Server, it's another product that we make here at SAFE. It provides basically an enterprise level application for running the different workspaces and jobs that you've built in Fme Workbench, and lets you kind of set up different ways to automate them. So here, this is a sample of the web interface for Fme Server. And we've got an automation here. So again, it's a graphical interface to be able to kind of drag and connect different actions that'll happen in response to particular triggers. So here, each of these orange boxes actually corresponds to a workspace that I've built in desktop and published to server, and then have automated so I can kind of handle the orchestration of how these jobs run. So that's the basics there. So I'll talk through a couple of extra things as well. So in particular, when you're working with APIs, you'll often have credentials stored as part of your workspace. So when you push that workspace up into the Fme Server environment, we also have some tools to help you manage those web connections and those credentials to make sure they're available on the server when you need them, and that they're only shared with the people that you'd like to have access to those as well. So when you go to publish any workflow to Fme Server, Fme will scan that workspace for any web connections that are used inside, and will give you some options to upload those as part of the publishing process. Once those connections are up on Fme Server, we then have a way for you to manage those directly. So you can come into the files and connections and web connections and see everything that's been published up there and everything that you have access to. This also gives you the ability to manage these connections. You can come in, update passwords as needed, or make adjustments as things change. And then getting to the automation piece. So I'll talk about scheduling to start. This is a good, simple use of Fme Server for just making sure your jobs run on a regular basis when you need them to make updates. So here you can have schedules that are as simple or as complicated as you need. So here we just have a very basic automation here with a schedule trigger that will run a single workspace whenever you want it to. On this other side here, we can also connect multiple workspaces. So if you have lots of workspaces doing lots of different API calls and complex work with inputs and outputs, you can connect those together into a kind of a more logical flow. So you can have certain things triggered by other workflows in there. So you can run a series of workspaces and workflows in response to this schedule trigger. In addition to that, which we won't get into too much today, we also have a lot of other types of triggers that you can use in automations to kick off your workflows. So some common examples would be things like a directory watch. So you can have FME server monitor a location, a shared file path or something like that. It can also connect to, we also have ones for FTP sites and a few other file storage types. Whenever data is changed in there, you can have a workflow run in response to that. So if someone updates a spreadsheet, maybe with some locations of where workers are out in the field doing jobs, as soon as that file gets updated, you can trigger other workspaces to run, maybe get that information and update other applications through the API. We have the same with email, so you can have someone send an email into FME server with or without data attached to kick off these jobs to run. And then you can also have webhooks. And this is useful when you're having an application integration scenario where maybe you have one application that will trigger a webhook that will then tell FME server to run a workflow and do other jobs in other APIs or in other applications as well. So I'll do a quick demo here just to show off scheduling. So for this one, I'm just going to build on what Sinai was showing earlier. So this is her MoveBank workspace where she's getting the bald eagle data and writing out to ArcGIS Online. So I'm going to publish this up to FME server here. So the first thing I can do is just connect to my FME server instance. I can then choose a location to store this workspace. I'm just putting this into a repository called API Webinar. It's basically just a folder to store my jobs. I'll replace the existing one there. And at this stage here, it'll let me upload any web connections that I have stored in my workspace. So I have my one for ArcGIS Online. So I already have a connection for that on FME server, so I can choose to update that or not. And then I can simply publish up to the server environment. Once that workspace is available, I can log into FME server. So this is the web interface for server. So you access this through a web browser. From in here, I can manage all the jobs that are available and see what's been happening at a glance. So what I want to do here is just build a simple automation. I can add a trigger. For this will be a scheduled event, but again, it could be anything here. There's a variety of different types depending on what your particular need is. And I can choose how frequently I'd like to run this job. So for my example, maybe I'd like to run it once a week on a Friday, just to update all the data and have that ready for the new week later on. So I click apply there. And the next thing I need to do is add an action. So this will trigger the workspace that I just published. So I can select that one. And I can also set any parameters that are available in that workspace. So I can choose a different bird I'd like to track for this one and click apply. Once that's ready, I can simply start the automation and have this run automatically for me without me needing to worry about clicking any buttons. So this will always come in, update that ArcGIS Online feature service every day, every Friday. So that's the basics there. Another alternative here is the ability to allow your end users to run their workflows on demand. So doing this on a schedule or an automated basis is great if you want a very hands-off approach and you just want that data to be updated frequently, and that's all you need to do. But what if you have a case where you'd either like a user to include input when they're running a job? So say, looking back to Sienna's example, maybe you'd like them to draw their commute area so that when they run the workflow, they'll get all the traffic data for the area that they're actually interested in, not for all of BC or all of Canada or whatever it was that API would return. So this is where you can create no-code web apps that can run your workflows that connect to your APIs. So it provides a simplified interface like this, where a user can simply come to a URL, click a few buttons to adjust their workflow, and run that and get the data that they'd like. So building an app like this in FME server is quite a simple process. You can simply come into the server apps, create a new one, fill in some information about the workspace you'd like to run, and then customize the look and feel of the web page. And once that's done, you're ready to go. Some tips for building these is particularly if you'd like to have user input, is to make good use of user parameters within your workspaces. So two that would be important, especially when you're working with APIs, would be web connections. So you could actually allow users to select the credentials they'd like to run the workflow with. So it'll present them with a drop-down where they can select which web connection they'd like to use with the workspace. And the second one is a geometry parameter. So this is great if your workflow is tied to location. So if you want to find your commute for one specific city within Vancouver or the greater Vancouver area, you can provide options for a user to select locations on a map to pass that into the workflow when it runs. So I'll do a quick demo here just to show an example of this. In my example here, I've got a workspace that allows users to download data from the US Census using their APIs. Problem is, I want my users to be able to select the area that they'd like to get census data for. And I don't want them to have to get Fme Workbench and run these workflows themselves directly. And I don't really want to write code to build a custom app for them. So for this solution, I'm going to use an Fme server app just to give a URL to users where they can access that and choose the location they'd like to get data from. So I'll show that briefly here. So I've got another workspace that's already built. I won't get too much into the details. I'll just highlight a few key pieces. So I'm using a custom transformer here called the US Census caller. And this is simply encapsulating kind of a little bit more advanced functionality, but it's making a few different calls to a few different web services. One to find the census area for a location that a user selected on a map. And then the second one is to actually make a call to the census database and pull in the actual census data. So what I'll point out here are the user parameters. So I've got one, I've only set up one here actually. And I can edit this just to show some details. So this is using a geometry parameter. So it doesn't look like much within Workbench. So you can see it's a point and I'm passing in some coordinates to the workspace. I can choose my configuration here. So if you wanted users to be able to select boxes, lines, or polygons, you could provide them with that as well. This one, I just want them to select a single point within the US. So when I run this in Workbench, I'd actually have to type in the point and add that in as GeoJson. But when I publish this stuff to Fme server, it actually presents a user with a map to select an area. So I'll show that right now. So I've already published that workspace up to server. So I'm just going to build a workspace app for this so that my users can run this when they want. So here I can just select that workspace, my US Census one. I can choose whether or not this app will require authentication. So I'll just make this open for this case. And here I can choose the default point for my area, which I'll leave there. I can also customize this app to make it look prettier if I wanted to. So maybe I'll choose the heading banner here. I'll set that to a map book. I can also change some of the color schemes and all that. Once I click OK, that will create my app for me. So I can copy this URL and paste that into my web browser. So now any user with this URL could come in here and they can choose an area they'd like to download data from. So I can click on this to pop up a little map. So now my users can come in, find on the map where they'd like to download data for, select that point, confirm, and then run the workflow. This will run the job. It will make the different calls to the various API services, collect my data, and this one will create an HTML report, which Fme server will return. So it shows the census area that we're looking at, and then a summary of some of the population statistics for that area. So it provides a nice way for users to get the data that they want on demand. So that brings us to the end here. So we've got just a couple of different tips here when you're working with APIs. One thing to consider is REST APIs do tend to change more frequently than your standard data types. So it's always a good idea, if you can, is to try to get on an email list for the developers for that API if you rely on the resource, just to know about any updates or changes that may be happening so you can react to those before they break all your jobs. Authentication, always good to stay on top of that as well. Passwords can expire, so you'll need to make sure to maybe mark it on your calendar and keep an eye on those as well. But what's nice, once you have your jobs in FME server as well, you can actually configure those jobs to alert you if anything fails. So if there is a change in the REST API that you weren't expecting, or a password changed on you, you can have it send you, say, an email or a Slack message if something goes wrong with your jobs. Yeah, definitely try it out for yourself if you're interested. If you've got an API in mind, definitely check out the documentation for that and see what you can do with the HTTP caller and some FME magic in there. We've also got this list of resources, so just different things available on our website and in our FME community. So definitely check those out. We'll be sharing out these slides and we'll share these links with you as well. So it's great stuff just to learn a little bit more about REST APIs in general. Also a reminder here, we've got the FME World Fair coming up for this year. So it's coming up from May 4th to 14th. So I think it'll be a great way, especially if you are interested in learning more about FME and some different innovative ways to use it. Check that out, safe.com/World Fair. It'll definitely be a fantastic event. There's a lot of really cool stuff coming from that. It's good to hear from a lot of other customers as well about what they're doing with FME in general. Yeah, that brings us to the end. I think we're right up on time now. But yeah, I guess we could do a bit of Q&A here if there are any good questions that we'd like to address. But that's everything for our content today. So you're free to go if you'd like to, but if you'd like to stick around for some questions, that would be awesome too.
Awesome. Great job, you guys. I did see a few questions coming in. I actually want to ask you guys this as well. Are we able to share out any of the workspaces that we showed?
Yeah, we should be able to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Okay, there were so many great questions coming in. Sienna, I'm not sure if you were watching any of them come through and have some favorites that you want to call out.
Yeah, so a common one was just, can we connect to this REST API? Can FME connect to any REST API, or are we limited in any ways? I think as long as the authentication isn't something crazy, like something that's totally out there that we don't support, we could connect to any REST API. I personally haven't hit any limitations connecting to a REST API. I'm not sure, Laura, Snai, have you hit anything?
Yeah, nothing too much. Yeah, usually the hardest part is just figuring it out sometimes. The documentation can vary depending on the API you're working with, so sometimes it's a little harder to understand or figure out, but yeah, I wouldn't say anything's been impossible.
Another question I saw a lot was pagination in API. So if you don't know, pagination is typically an API won't return all the records in one go, because that would just take a very long time. So it might only send 50 records at a time, and then it has pages where it stores the rest of a record. So how do you go through? How do you get all of those records? I'm not sure if you guys want to chat about that. What are your tips for pagination?
Yeah, I think that's where I'm going to say a custom transformer loop. So it's a little bit more of an advanced functionality in FME. But yeah, it's where you'd want to use a loop. So you can kind of loop through those different pages. So every time, yeah, you can kind of count the number of records that you're getting and kind of see what you need to do and change I think it's the count of records. So you can have the number that you return each time and increase that to go through everything.
Some APIs are really good and they'll tell you how many pages you have. Yeah. And then you could use something like a cloner instead. If you know how many pages you have, you could use a cloner and then you don't have to use the loop. Mark Ireland wrote a really good blog on this. It's called To Loop or To Not Loop. And it's all about when you should loop and when you should not. And typically our advice is if you can avoid using the loop, if you know the amount of records you need, avoid it. But if you have to, if you don't know how many pages of records you have, then you can always loop through. Another big question was all about authentication, like what are our best practices with authentication in FME? Like, should you be creating web connections? How are passwords stored in FME? I'm not sure if you guys want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, passwords are encrypted, so you don't have to worry about them being stored in plain text somewhere on your computer or anything like that. Someone coming across them, they will be encrypted. When you're uploading them to FME server, as far as best practices, you are able to control who can use them, who can see them, who can access them, especially if you're sharing workspaces. You can even set a user parameter so that users can use their own authentication when they're running one of their workspaces. So they just use their own account. Yeah, I think that covers it for server. Do you have anything to add to it, guys?
Yeah, I would say if you can, I would use a web connection, because when you share a web connection, sorry, I should say, when you share a workspace with a web connection to another person, they don't get that web connection. So it's a great way to handle everything. The password is very well hidden in a web connection, so I would use web connections when possible. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just reading the new questions right now. Oh, can the HTTP caller handle errors and retries?
It's a good one.
Don't think so built in. I think you would need to handle that yourself in your workspace. You could have a loop. If it's rejected, send it back and do a retry up to like a possible 3. And after that, you should probably not hit that resource anymore.
Yeah, we also have a decelerator transformer that can help with that exponential back off, so you can kind of slow it down so it doesn't like hammer the web service too badly when you're trying to do some retries there.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Snai.
That's okay. No. I was just going to add on, if you have a web service being used in an automation or a schedule on FME server, you can also handle the rejected port. So if a call doesn't go through because a web service is down, or maybe your credentials have changed, you didn't know it, you can send a notification to yourself, just letting you know what the error message was, and then deal with it in a way that you'll need to. But yeah, you can handle those error messages with notifications too.
There's another question about rate limits on APIs. Will we hit rate limits if we're using FME to access APIs? And for that, it really depends on what you're doing and the API that you're connecting to. But we do have a decelerator transformer, like Laura mentioned, to slow down your calls. So I think I often hit it with Shopify. It's like you can only make so many requests per second. FME is very fast. It will try to hit things as fast as possible. So you can use a decelerator and slow down your calls if you are hitting rate limits. I think that's pretty much it. Have you guys read anything that you want to touch on a little bit?
Yeah, there's a lot of good questions. So for anything that we haven't addressed, we'll follow up after the webinar as well, just so you know. So we're not ignoring you.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Also, I'm wondering, like, if people maybe go away and watch the video afterwards and then have questions, what should they do?
Yeah, so there's a few things you can do. The first I would recommend is just posting on our community. If you have like a very specific question, like, have you used this API before? The community is probably the best place to put that kind of information. If you're just wondering how FME works and how do I access this resource, you can always come into our live chat, which you can find on our website. And then if you have something where you're like, I believe this should be working and it's just not working for me, how do I do this? I don't think something's right here. Maybe there's something wrong with the product. that's when you'd want to file a support case. So you can do that through the community as well, or through live chat. If you just chat with us, we could file a support case for you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm loving, people were so kind in the comments too. A lot of people really appreciated the presentation today. So good job, you guys, on all your hard work. And Sinai, for your first webinar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Many more.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. We are glad you found this helpful. And like Sienna mentioned, if you have questions afterwards, please reach out to us on the community or on live chat. I see Matt just left a comment that live chat is sometimes offline. And yes, it goes in and out, but I believe you can still send a message, right?
It shouldn't be offline for several weeks.
Oh, okay.
It's like typically the day. So sorry. It's like we'll be on from 9 a.m. to 12, and then from 1 to 4, and this is all in PST. And then we'll be offline on weekends. We will go offline a little bit around Christmas, or maybe like a certain day for a few hours. Let's say there's a really important meeting everyone needs to attend. We will go offline for that, but we shouldn't be offline for weeks. If you're seeing that, please reach out to us, like in a support case or something. I wonder if it's like a browser thing, like I've heard issues with Firefox maybe, and live chat, but we definitely should not be offline for weeks.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, good example of when to reach out for support. So I'll just chat out when we are online, kind of the hours, so that people can see. Perfect. Cool. So yes, we will get these workspaces packaged up. We will get the recording put together, and we will send out the slides as well. So everyone watch your emails later today or tomorrow, and we'll send you all the things. And then don't forget to download, there's a couple handouts with this webinar as well. A ebook on APIs, and then a fun comic book, because it's so funny and adorable, and everyone should check it out. Cool. Okay, so what I'll do is we can go offline. I'll leave it running for another like 5 minutes for any last questions behind the scenes, or if anyone wants to save out any links or answers that we gave you, do it in this 5 minutes, and then I'll close it down. Perfect.
Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.